All right, so today we talk about the World War One events at home, what I like to call the war at the crib. So, objectives here: be able to explain how business and government cooperated during the war. Okay, explain how the war encouraged the movement of African Americans to the North. It seems really weird, but man, it made a major shift in American history. It's going to cause a lot of things to change. All right, describe the attacks on civil liberties in the United States. So, like, how are our freedoms attacked? Not by enemies, really kind of from within during this war. So this is Woodrow Wilson. He was, of course, the president of the United States during this, and was at the time widely hailed as somebody that was seen as a good president. As time has gone on, time has not treated Woodrow Wilson very well when it comes to historians looking at presidents. Okay, so financing the war, how do we pay for this? We talk a lot during the propaganda activity about Liberty bonds, right? Sold to Americans. There were $20 billion worth sold. $10 billion were given to the Allied cause. So they were given to foreign countries instead of here. Okay, they were sold, like I mentioned before, by the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts. They literally went door to door, which is something that we don't quite do it nearly as much as we used to. A lot of the stuff is online. People post on social media, but it used to be the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts would go door to door selling Girl Scout cookies, and that's where this came from. The idea that you could go do that. So they sold all kinds of Liberty bonds. Those little kids would be real effective, right? A little boy, a little girl. My daddy or my uncle and my brother is at war, and so I want you to buy one of these bonds to help them, and so it worked. Okay, managing the economy. There were three new agencies, okay, that the government created to deal with this. The War Industries Board was led by a guy named Bernard Baruch, and he oversaw the war production. So a place that used to make Jeeps. It's a terrible example. Can you tell them at school? They used to make cars, right? So like a Ford plant that used to make cars. Yeah, we had cars in 1918. They would shift and make tanks, right? Or they might make machine guns or whatever, but they had to shift to make something. Now, we're going to do this a little bit in World War One, but man, oh man, in World War Two, this is really going to happen. But World War One kind of gives us some practice going forward. Okay, there's also the National War Labor Board. So Samuel Gompers, if you remember from the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that we looked at the end of last semester, and we talked about how the unions really helped protect the people as they went forward. Well, Samuel Gompers was the president of the AFL, American Federation of Labor, and he was able to control the unions during that time, and there were no labor disputes in 1918 and 19, major ones. And that was his doing to try to protect that worker, right? So that the worker would get paid, the companies would make money, and it would help us win the war. Okay. The next one is the War Labor Relations Board, and that set wages and hours for war industries. So all of a sudden now you get people working, and now you have how much money they're going to make, like a minimum wage, and you have the amount of hours that they're going to work. So now you're getting work hour limits, right? So the war is going to kind of push those things forward that were a part of the platform of like the Bull Moose Party and all those progressives. If you remember the progressive era, well, that was like 1908, 1912. Well, this is 1918. So all that stuff is now coming into effect. Okay. All right. I want you to take a minute and look at this picture. Okay. Count the number of people. Notice the way that they're dressed, what they got going on with their car. You can see on the license plate, the license plate's Florida. Okay, you can look on the top of that car. There's like a 55-gallon drum up there. There's buckets up there that are tied down. Okay, and these people are dressed pretty nice. Okay, and they got a lot of stuff, right? So this isn't necessarily like, somebody leaving the South because they're terribly poor sharecropper. This is a successful family in Florida that says, you know what, we're out of here. We're leaving, okay, in Florida. This happened all over the South, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, okay, that people are leaving and they're going to go to the North. Because if you remember, all the way back to the Civil War, the Northern advantage was that they had factories. Okay, well, the North still has a majority of the factories. So minorities, black people in the South were like, man, this place sucks. We get discriminated against. We don't have our rights. We can't get good jobs. There's not enough good jobs to go around for for everybody in our family and all of our friends. So we're leaving. We're going to go to Cleveland. We're going to go to St. Louis. We're going to go to East St. Louis. We're going to go to Chicago because we can go to the north. We're going to face less discrimination. It's not going to be perfect. Okay. But we're also going to have way more job opportunities, and we're going to be able to rise up. Okay. Economically, and that's what we need. All right. So they're also going to go to places like New York in crazy numbers, right? This map shows it, and you can see all these cities in the north where these people, the African Americans from the South, are moving to. You can also see them moving out west. Okay. This is known as the Great Migration inside the United States. Okay. Where African Americans are going to leave the South in crazy numbers. Okay, to go to the north. So 6 million African Americans is estimated. There's no like official number because they didn't like get a ticket and go to the north, right? People just left. That between 1915 and 1917, they left. And I already covered the reasons why they moved, right? There was racial discrimination in the South. There was literally legal segregation. Don't forget, like you had black drinking fountains and white drinking fountains. Well, you didn't have that as much in the north, still there, but not nearly as much. Okay, so where did they go specifically? They went to cities, right? So if you look at this map, you can see all these places: Milwaukee, Chicago, Toledo, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, right? And they went there because they wanted more economic opportunity, okay? And they wanted freedom. And they're going to get those things. It's some more freedom, not perfect, but they're going to get some freedom, okay? Remember, in 1918, World War I's going on. We were 30 years before Martin Luther King. Okay, so you're in the height of this discrimination against black people in the South. Okay, so this guy is Herbert Hoover, and Hoover is going to be the president in 1928. But remember, he's not the president yet. Okay, so managing the economy, this is where Hoover comes in. Regulating food and consumption. The Food Administration was led by Herbert Hoover. Okay, Hoover set price controls. The government did. So they would control how much a loaf of bread would be, how much a dozen eggs would be. Right? They had total control over that. Okay, they also rationed out different things to make sure that our troops and the Allied troops, remember that blue and red line on that map from the battles, right? That thing didn't move much, but the people still had to eat, right? So we got to get them food. So there were rations in America so that the food could go to the soldiers. The price controls and the rations weren't done like you didn't have to do them. A lot of people did them. They were voluntary, and it worked well enough, right? And remember, we're only there for like 18 months, so it's not like this went on for a long time. And then the Fuel Administration, which we still have today. We don't have the Fuel Administration, but we still have the effect of it, and the effect of it is daylight savings time. So at the time, electricity, like you and I know electricity, you turn the light on, okay? A lot of that was based on using kerosene. Okay, so and kerosene wasn't oil, right? Well, if it got dark at 5 o'clock, well, then you had to turn the kerosene lamp on, right? And that would be fuel that people had to use. Well, the fuel needed to go to the war, so you don't want to turn your lamp on at 5 o'clock. Well, then let's change the hours and let's fall back and spring forward so that we have way more sunlight during the summertime. Okay, and so we don't have to use as much fuel. Not a bad idea during the war. But it's 100 years later and we still have it. Okay. All right. Enforcing loyalty, right? So this is that nationalism was a part of the mania for the cause of the war, right? But you saw these propaganda posters from the Committee of Public Information. It was led by a guy named George Creel. His job was to rally support for the war. So the things that you saw, and those of you that are in the classroom, you can see, remember the gorilla with the question mark. Okay. You had the witch, right, with the Uncle Sam hat with the Liberty Bonds coming out of it and the German soldier's hat, right? So all of those things, okay, were part of the Committee of Public Information to gather support for the war. There was also great fear of foreigners, and we've covered this a couple times. Immigrants were actually killed. Okay, there were different episodes, but the most famous one for us anyway was Robert Prager, because that happened in Collinsville. He was literally lynched by an angry mob because he was allegedly a socialist and had given a speech in Maryville. There was no total proof that that's what really happened, but then he was killed. And of course, the Alien and Sedition Act is where the people have to register. Prager, by the way, did register. So the literacy test for immigrants, you could only get in if you could speak English, right? So this is important to remember because when you get to the 1920s, you're going to see something called the Red Scare, where we don't want any immigrants at all. We want to be isolated again. We don't want any connection to Europe when we get to the 1920s. Okay, but this literacy test comes about during World War One. Okay, remember enforcing loyalty. Wilson said when we went to war that we're doing it to make the world safe for democracy. Okay, that Sedition Act, because remember that Alien Act where you had to register, it was the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act said you could not discuss anything against our government. Okay, there were over 1,000 people that were convicted. Okay, of this. So literally, our government is going after people that speak out against us, right? Well, that's kind of the same thing that's going on now when you look at the free speech and the censorship with some of the Twitter. And I'm not giving my opinion, but some people would say this is the same thing. So the Sedition Act, you couldn't say anything. You couldn't say, as your teacher, I certainly couldn't sit in front of you and say, oh, our government's ridiculous. Like they should never do that. I could get in trouble for that. Okay, under this Sedition Act. Okay, today I can say whatever I want. President Trump is a bozo. President Biden is a bozo, right? I can say whatever I want. I shouldn't say things like that, but I wouldn't get arrested for it, right? Under the Sedition Act, I could. Okay. All right. So there was anti-war sentiment, people that didn't like this at all. There was a group called the Wobblies, okay, the industrial workers of the world, and they were socialists, okay, that believed in a socialist form of government, and they wanted to overthrow capitalism. They didn't like it because to them, in a war, their companies were making huge money, and the capitalists, right, the company owners, the business owners, were the ones making the money. They were led by a guy named Eugene V. Debs. He ran for president a bunch of times. He did not like the war because, in his mind, the industries got wealthier, right, but the everyday common man went to war and died, or their kids went to war and died, and he didn't think that was good. Okay, well, these guys were, they were seen as really bad. They were speaking up, and they had every constitutional right to do that. But man, people literally hunted them down, okay, by vigilantes. A vigilante is somebody that takes the law into their own hands. Okay, Prager is an example. He really didn't have a connection to Eugene V. Debs, but if he spoke and they thought he spoke and spoke about socialist issues, well, that's a problem, right? For the people that didn't like him, so they went after these Wobblies because they didn't like him. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this, right? Let's go back to the beginning and back to the three objectives. Explain how business and government cooperated during the war. Okay. Explain how, and connect this with the unions too. Don't forget about the unions. Explain how the war encouraged the movement of African Americans to the North. Okay. One thing I didn't really touch on was how the factories had to build all the weapons. So we talked about how they converted, but there's jobs like crazy because they're building all these weapons. So that's why African Americans start to move to the North. And once for these 2 years where they do it, then all of a sudden more and more people are going to come and show up. Okay. Then describe the attacks on civil liberties. So think about our rights and that Alien Act with Prager and the Sedition Act with Prager as well. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this and the war at the crib.